Hello and welcome to the grand finale of our InRetroSpect series. I am Daniel Frost, and I am here to draw a close to our journey through the world created by Hideo Kojima. Alongside me, pulling in for its final stop, is Pete Willington, Kris Darby, and Sam Turner. Over the past month, we have cast our analytical eyes over the 4 major releases in the Metal Gear Solid series. First of all, we all got together and discussed the original Metal Gear Solid. Then Pete discussed why Sons of Liberty and its hero Raiden deserve a place in our hearts. Then Kris took us back in time with his views on Snake Eater. And then finally last week, we heard Sam wax lyrical on the joys of the Guns of the Patriots. And so we find ourselves full circle. Here we are again, huddled around the fire to launch into part 5 of InRetroSpect. So we've picked apart each edition piece by piece, and they are still all available at www.inretrospectpodcast.com in case you missed any. But it's now time to think of where this series has brought us, and where it's certainly going to move onwards into the future. First of all, I'd like to ask you guys, has Snake ever inspired you in real life? Have you ever had to adopt any of his stealth techniques to get by in an awkward situation?
You guys, you know me pretty well, don't you? You know, I'm not like a skinflint or anything like that, and I won't turn my nose up of, giving. But at the end of the day, I am a student, so it kind of teeters which side I go for. But I give to charity, and I have given to charity. But like on my high street, every day, there is at least 3 individuals with buckets or clipboards or whatever, spaced apart along the broad high street, and they will literally try any tactic possible. It doesn't even matter if you've got headphones on, or if you're blind or anything. They will grab you. So I've kind of, using the sort of skills I've acquired in Metal Gear Solid 3, when I've got the lab coat on and the glasses and I have to sneak around, I've found a way of walking up and down that high street without being coerced or grabbed by any of these 3 individuals. I've got this sort of radar built in my head now that I can see them coming in the distance. They're looking at me like Jaws' fin above the water, and I can kind of get through now. Beforehand, I used to have to cross the road to kind of really avoid them, but now I found ways of being able to sort of hang around a bit in underneath shop door windows, or make it look as if I'm running for a bus. I found really good ways of working my way around them.
I was going to say, why don't you just walk down the same street holding a clipboard, and then when you meet them, just like nod them and just go, tough day, eh? And then just walk past.
Sam, I'm glad you said that, because that would send my camouflage index to 95% or something. The only thing I want to do left to do is, what I'm going to do to prepare myself, because it can get a bit raucous and a bit rough on a night out in Exeter. Well, there are certain areas that are pretty rough. You've got rough individuals that look at you in weird ways. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to arm myself with a collection of gentleman's literature. And what I will do is, if I'm grabbed at all or cornered by any of these unruly individuals, I will take the opportunity to deposit, open a copy of this gentleman's literature, face up, down on the pavement, which will act as a kind of a bait to kind of lure them away from me, and then I can get off scot-free.
Sam, what stealth techniques have you utilised Snake styley in your everyday life?
Well, in a mode of disappointment, I don't think I've ever actually done anything inspired by Snake, actually, but I definitely think that Snake reaffirmed a lot of my behaviour, especially when I was younger, because when I was younger I was obsessed with James Bond and Mission Impossible and The Man from U.N.C.L.E. and The Saint and all those kind of like Avengers and all those kind of like cheesy sort of late 80s, early 90s spy and Bond films, and I used to always run around the house trying to sneakily get into like the living room without my parents noticing and like hide behind the couch. And I did that even before I even played Metal Gear Solid. Then I sort of saw Snake and how he acted and thought, this is really, really cool. But probably more than anything, Snake actually put me off sort of behaving like that, because it was slightly a bit more realistic. Like the Man from U.N.C.L.E. would get trapped in a prison and he'd just open up the sole of his shoe and inside it would just be a key that would pick it, and he'd get out, and then he'd just like karate chop the prison guard in the neck and he'd collapse and he'd get out of there. Whereas Snake kind of, had to lie on the floor, put a pool of ketchup down. Once a guard came in, he had to batter him to death.
You see, mine's kind of similar. I mean, in that it was when I was younger, I suppose, like just right around the time when the first MGS was coming out. I was still in the Scouts. This was just about the sort of time that we were kind of old enough to go and play like wide games. And I remember distinctly kind of using some of the thoughts and procedures that I would use like in Metal Gear Solid in those kind of environments, way before MGS3, that kind of thing. But apart from that, I've hidden in the odd cardboard box.
Okay, so in this podcast, we're going to be looking at a lot of the themes that you find in the Metal Gear series, and then looking at how those themes are maybe used in today's games and maybe going forward. One of the themes which weaves its way through all the Metal Gear series, and perhaps the one overarching theme, is that each of the main series has been embroiled in an element of war and battle, whether this is a global war, like in 3 and 4, or in a much smaller, more intimate conflicts that could result in global conflicts, as in 1 and 2. Through its narrative, the Metal Gear series has always been largely outspoken and clear in its views on battle and conflict. But how do we think that its views and its presentation of war has developed and changed over the 4 titles?
If you take MGS 1 to 3 and you kind of look at its attitudes to battles and that kind of thing, they remain largely the same. It's only really MGS 4 in which there are significant changes and attitudes to war that particularly changes. So, for example, throughout the first 3, you have these big speeches by Gray Fox and Master Miller and President Johnson and lots of other different characters about free will and how free will is something that you need on the battlefield, and how it's about the individual on the field and it's not about government controlling everything. So you have, things like Gray Fox speaking to Snake, and he says, "We're not tools of the government or anyone else." And you have Master Miller say, "There's not a soldier alive that doesn't question himself, and if there is one, then he's nothing more than a murderer." You have these big speeches by these characters, and they honestly believe that one man can make a difference in a war. So you get all these speeches in the first 3 games, and then in MGS4, the game actually opens with "War has changed." And as Snake says, it isn't about governments, it isn't about like organizations and nations and that kind of thing. It's more about money, and it's more about prevention and regulation and control over the individual for a bigger cause.
And even how number 4 is presented compared to the 1, 2 and 3, especially on 1, 2 and 3, you're dropped into areas where it's quiet, secluded, and you're largely on your own to some sort of extent. Maybe one or 2 people there, but in number 4, you're dropped into an active war zone, which is the first time that sort of happened. Well, I don't really think that number 4 greatly changes a different attitude to war, but I think it's finally Kojima finally sort of trying to affirm his views on war and where he thinks Metal Gear Solid specifically stands on war, and that's why he starts you off in that war zone compared to the silence and this slow sort of ebbing of war and this theory on it out of the first 3 games. I think that's where it sort of changes. It's that whole presentation of where you are and how you're battling and who you're battling against. It's a lot more focused and forthright in number 4 than it is in 1, 2 and 3, where it takes a little bit of time to work out why this battle is being fought and who's the actual enemy, and why indeed should Snake or Jack be involved in the fight at all.
If you look at the supporting cast of MGS4 as well, it's a lot larger than any other Metal Gear, and I feel that Kojima does this to suggest that in Metal Gear Solid 4 it's much more of a combined effort to achieve the final result. In MGS2, for example, it's only really 3 or 4 people that make it to the end and have any sort of sway on the outcome. At the end of MGS1, it's 2 guys. In MGS3, you are left in the middle of a field, one-on-one with your maker, essentially. But at the end of MGS4, you're surrounded by your friends and your allies, and it really has been a team effort to get up to this point. And it is, Kojima's way of essentially saying that in this era, in a modern era, wars, the individual really isn't a lot, and that it is all about control now, and it is all about working within a unit.
I was going to say, with the 4th one, it did definitely just, I think with the first 3, you could argue it almost as part of it being a character study, in the fact that it's kind of one man against the world in the first 3, because being 3 different characters, you have the Solid Snake, you have Raiden, and then you've got Naked Snake. Whereas in the 4th one, because we then get back to Solid Snake, it puts the war as the front and centre, and it's the world around that.
So the first 3 games are sort of character studies, let's say, and the 4th game is more of a society study. Do you think that's fair?
I think that's fair. I mean, it does say a lot. I mean, a lot of the story as it comes through, especially at the start of Metal Gear Solid 4, is the whole thing of war has grown so much since, because at the end of the day, you haven't really played in the present day since Metal Gear Solid 2. And since then, as you see from Raiden's huge change in Metal Gear Solid 4, that the world has completely changed. Whereas the other ones, it was just one man's fight against an enemy. Whereas now it becomes, you are just a cog in the machine.
Well, I agree with bits of all of you, actually. I agree with Sam that their attitude to the war doesn't change. And I agree with Pete that number 4 is obviously quite a change in how it's realised. And I agree with you, Frosty, in the sense that I think having that sense of split, it makes it a lot more global. I mean, compared to the others, Metal Gear Solid 4 is the jet setter. It travels the world. Yeah. But Metal Gear Solid, for me, is a really important one, because you kind of get the feeling that it's here that really war is starting to change. Battle is changing. I'm just quoting Grey Fox here. Hand to hand, it is the basis of all combat. Only a fool trusts his life to a weapon. There's this idea that there's no longer a sense of nobility and honour in fighting head to head. It's now all those decisions of fighting are handled by other people above, which is obviously an allegory to many of the wars and things. General Haig in World War I, for example. And that's kind of parried with Snake's idea of there are no heroes in war. It's not to say that there weren't heroes in war, it's just there aren't any more now. And it's this idea, he feels completely lost. I mean, what is it to be a soldier? That's the real thing he's struggling with. What is a soldier now? And Metal Gear Solid 2 and Metal Gear Solid 1, they talk about characters that grew up on the battlefield. Sniper Wolf says she grew up on the battlefield. Olga says she grew up on the battlefield. What is it to grow up on a battlefield? And then at the end of Metal Gear Solid 2, it's this idea of questioning reality. You've got to the point now the soldier is so lost that they're actually made to question the reality. Raiden is made to ponder, where does he fit into this whole world? Are we all part of someone else's plan? And then when we get to Metal Gear Solid 4, the control has completely been taken away from that of the soldier. Snake thought he'd done away with it. He turned his back on it. He became a member of philanthropy. But now, with everyone tripping over each other in that classic scene at the beginning of Metal Gear Solid 4 because of Liquid Ocelot's plans, this control has been taken away from the soldier. The soldier really is, as you say, a pawn, a cog in the machine, as you put it. That's that thing. It's his loss of control from the soldier, and at the same time, what it is to be a soldier. And that consequently leads to the deep philosophical sort of thoughts and queries and questions that go throughout the series. But they all stem from this idea that I'm playing a character that is incredibly lost.
But I'd argue that this loss of control and this loss of sort of this turning of war from a feared object to a commodity that's also, you know, that's sold and hired and advertised in the way that it is in Metal Gear Solid 4. You know, as soon as you start up the game, you get an advert for one of the main cause of the war economy, selling people something. Really, how this shift sort of changed was really made in Metal Gear Solid 3. There's a really great and superbly powerful bit about how war is changing from the fighter to a lot more of a positional and political stance. Where this section where Sokolov is talking about how scientists started to become embroiled in this pursuit for achievement to start to get political one-upmanship basically over the two powers, Russia and the USA, and it was this theory of scientists taking their theory and their knowledge and their science, and then politicians using that in a practice that was abhorrent and that was totally against what they stood for theoretically as scientists, and using that to gain their power. Volgin is probably the character that greatly represents how politicians have taken the ideals of science and using it to gain this one-upmanship over their counterparts. Now in the end he's beaten by nothing more than a simple bullet or a simple tranquilizer dart, depending on how you do it. And in Metal Gear Solid 3 I think that's where it starts to happen, where you start seeing this scientific involvement in war, this control starting to happen, and a lot more happening behind the scenes to try and get that one-upmanship before a bullet has even fired.
So as we've discussed, war is probably highlighted most prominently in the fourth title, Guns of the Patriots. And perhaps one of the most poignant moments of that game is when you return to Shadow Moses to find it reduced to a lump of rusting metal, a shadow of its former self. What I'd like to talk about now is whether the repetition of the story and the characters in the Metal Gear series, would some argue that it's a piece of lazy storytelling, or is perhaps the cyclical nature of the story maybe an element of the fact that it's more hereditary and the fact that it does always come back to where it begins?
Well, for me, Shadow Moses, it's very much a haunted space, particularly obviously in Metal Gear Solid 4 when you return to, which is I think what you're hinting at with the question, this idea of returning to it. So the Shadow Moses incident is obviously an event that's very much prevalent in the Metal Gear Solid series. In fact, it is the one piece of geography that kind of unites all the games and joins all the games together, because it is constantly mentioned and constantly reiterated in various different forms. I don't see it as a piece of lazy storytelling. In fact, I think it has a really, really deep sort of, in my opinion, psychogeographical resonance, particularly as me and Sam have waxed lyrical on in the past, Metal Gear Solid 4, this idea of returning to Shadow Moses. Seeing it there as it is, it's really interesting, but it works this whole cyclical nature of the series, and going back to it merely just compounds its significance. Particularly with Metal Gear Solid 4, where you're playing a character that has aged, and you feel it is aging. To see Shadow Moses merely highlights the fact that you have grown old with this place, with and without this place. It's very much a part of the fabric of the Metal Gear Solid universe, as you are, as your character. And the opportunity to walk the same corridors, and at the same time in instances reiterate the same thoughts and feelings as when we first played it, which we talked about in our first sort of InRetroSpect special, when we first played Metal Gear Solid. To reiterate those thoughts, I think, it's that wonderful, some would argue perhaps self-indulgent, but it brings to the surface a sense of nostalgia. But the story doesn't end there. The Shadow Moses incident, I think, is Act 4. It's Act 4 of the game.
Yeah.
The story doesn't end there. It is something there, is a reminder before the final hurdle. which I think is of incredible significance for those who would perhaps say that it is lazy, it's self-indulgent. I think one of the major sort of bones of contention against that would be the fact that the game doesn't end there. It's really just, it's Act 4 of Metal Gear Solid 4. It's really just the final hurdle before the game. But you have to have this final hurdle. You have to jump this final hurdle. It's there as a reminder of what was and a springboard into what could be.
And let's not forget that in purely financial terms, to construct a current generation game and an environment in a current generation game is exceptionally expensive. Art assets are some of the most expensive things to create, and that's why you see, you know, tons of special editions and stuff like that, including loads and loads of art, because so much of it gets made and so much money gets spent on it and very little of it actually gets seen. To create an environment like Shadow Moses on the PS3, to recreate it, is an expensive proposition. So for Kojima to want to include that in MGS4, there's an importance there, even if it's just a balancing budget importance. I mean, we go back to Shadow Moses twice, if we think about it, in MGS4. We go back once in a dream where we play an emulated version of the PS1 game, and then we go back there in this souped up version like Kris was just describing. So for Kojima to want to include that, there has to be some sort of importance. And I would say, Kris, you actually touched on an adjective that I think is very, very telling about Shadow Moses, and you said that it was a haunted place, and I agree with you, but I also think that it is a place that actively haunts Solid Snake. It's a location that is constantly referred to in the rest of the games. They're constantly talking about Shadow Moses and the incident on Shadow Moses. And Snake is very much all about Shadow Moses, because it's really the one big mission in the Solid universe that he takes part in. He's meant to not even be there on the tanker. He's supposedly meant to have died on the tanker. So that wasn't a mission that he was meant to be a part of, and he's certainly not mentioned as being part of the S3 program. So it haunts Snake, and I feel that its inclusion in MGS4 and its ultimate destruction, and the fact that Rex is destroyed at the end, and most of Shadow Moses is kind of destroyed at the end, and when you're walking through it, it's decrepit, it's broken down, it's worn out. It's because on one level Snake has to destroy this legend that has been created around Shadow Moses, and in another way it's the director destroying Metal Gear Solid 1, because neither of the two sequels afterwards would be as revered as the first. And it's almost like in MGS4 he's making this statement of, I am going to destroy my original game because MGS4 is the game I'm creating now, and this is what I want the Metal Gear universe to be now and to be remembered for. If this is the end of Snake's tale, I sure as hell don't want people to be thinking about Shadow Moses and all that sort of stuff. I want them to be thinking about the grander scheme of things and MGS4.
And even though there is the giant metaphor of Shadow Moses, for the people who have not got it yet, repetition is a purposeful theme that runs through Metal Gear Solid, and I think it's quite tempting for people who maybe not picked up on the themes of repetition to maybe get a little bit over sentimental maybe about Shadow Moses and think that it's just a bit of fan service and maybe a bit of lazy narrative. But looking in more depth at the other three games, you can just see there's so much parity that goes on between all of them. There's so many themes that are reflected in them, and different story arcs as well. You know, Snake's mission in MGS1 directly relates to Raiden's mission on MGS2. Both of them simulations, ways of training a soldier, finding out how they're dealing with different situations. And then Raiden again certainly replicates in MGS4, just near the end on Outer Haven, how Grey Fox helps out Snake to try and make it further and try and help rescue this broken and battered world. Every single one of the MGS games ends in a final hand-to-hand boss fight where there are no weapons really, and they're fighting fist to fist, and that's how it happens. There's also the repetition of the bosses as well. Each one of them in every single game is this sort of hybrid of a super soldier, a set of rogue squadrons set apart from their from their usual reins of control, whether their controls were that of a normal life and ripped apart from that through post-traumatic stress disorder, or that role of being a soldier and torn apart from that through just want of a better world and led apart by tyranny and a misunderstanding, as in the other three games. It's definitely a repetition that sings through, and the boss speaks to Naked Snake about it just before the final battle, and in MGS3, that there is this pattern that people just have to go through. That's life. Once I die, there needs to be another boss. It needs to happen, or else just life can't continue. That cycle has to keep on going. The world has to stay in order through that way, and that cycle is the only way to do it. And I think that the repetition goes on throughout the whole of the series. It just can't be ignored. I don't think it can even be put down to laziness, because it's put in there so purposely and so substantially, to a degree that it has to mean something, and it has to reflect something about how Kojima thinks about the order of the world. And we're all destined for one thing, but yet that will lead to another thing, and this natural cycle of life just keeps on going on and on.
There is this repetitive aspect, and I agree with you, Sam. I think that Kojima does believe that there is some sort of, not necessarily divine, but some sort of fate tying the world together. And in a game that we haven't explored on InRetroSolid, Portable Ops, there's a character with split personality disorder called both Eliza and Ursula, and she says, the futures we saw were the same. Naked Snake, you will destroy Metal Gear, and you will build a new Metal Gear to take its place. Your children, les enfants terribles. Snake, your son will bring the world to ruin, and your son will save the world. Kojima uses this fortune teller, and the fact is, this fortune teller gets it spot on, even if it is a little bit ambiguous. But Kojima kind of likes this idea that people can see into the future and be able to see into the past. Psycho Mantis is in Metal Gear Solid. It's this idea of repetition and things happening to roughly the same characters in roughly the same way over and over again. But at the same time, and this is where I kind of disagree with your point, he does have characters that challenge this idea of fate, this kind of concept of Ouroboros. So I don't think it's any coincidence that the main character is called Snake. One character in particular, and it's Naomi in the original Metal Gear Solid. She says, you mustn't allow yourself to be chained to fate, to be ruled by your genes. And I think that there is a sort of rebellious attitude in sort of Kojima's narrative here, that is kind of seeing fate and seeing how things do happen, and how things do kind of end up the same in all of the games, and yet there are slight differences. There are choices that specific characters make that change things ever so slightly and mean that it isn't exactly the same story over and over and over again. There is a twist on it. And she says, human beings can choose the kind of life that they want to lead. What's important is that you choose life and then live. And it's this interesting idea of, even though we are kind of stuck in this fate, or for most of the time, sometimes the individual, as I say, this is in the first MGS where the individual is very much focused on. There's this idea that the individual can make a change, even if it is a small change. Even if by the end of the conclusion of all of the Metal Gear Solids, all of the numbered Metal Gear Solids, I should say, ultimately somebody is still controlling somebody else. There is this idea that one person can try and make a difference.
One of the themes that seems to be raised time and time again in the Metal Gear series are the idea of parental figures, or lack of them. Many characters either adopt a parental figure or prefers life without one. What I'd like to ask you guys is, why do you think Hideo is so keen to have motherless or fatherless characters? What does he lose or gain from presenting them like this? Let's start with you, Sam.
Just like with the repetition theme, it's something that raises its head quite often within the series. Probably the addition of the series that it does seem more prevalent in the most is definitely Metal Gear Solid 3, where there is this overt connection, sexual or Oedipal or paternal otherwise, between Naked Snake and the boss. There is connection, and certainly Eva at first picks up on it as a sexual connection that she tries and breaks, but then she understands it, that it's more of a sort of unconditional, almost love, an unbreakable bond between the two. And that theme of characters either searching for an adoptive mother or living life away from any sort of family influence. Like, it's not really clear whether Meryl really has much of a family or whether she's spent much time for them. Otacon certainly has difficulty in building relationships. Even with Sonny, he has a difficulty in Metal Gear Solid 4 with really trying to grasp a relationship with this child. I mean, she's brought up to just be Otacon's sister, almost a replacement than that, until he realises at the end of Metal Gear Solid 4 that, you know, she's different than that. She's parts of his sister, but again, there's that cyclical, hereditary nature to it, that it's kind of natural that she will just take it on, but she's sort of breaking a bit of that cycle. Also, other characters, Snake himself is really quite technically fatherless. He's also quite technically motherless until he finds Big Mama in Metal Gear Solid 4 and finds out that there's probably more connection, that she's probably his greatest connection to what would have been a mother within this life. And just like the nature of the cyclical and the repetition, it's definitely a theme that pops up purposely for a reason. And I don't think it's essentially quite Oedipal. I don't think there's anything sexually promiscuous or sexually sort of, there's no sort of sex driven within these characters to find a mother or for any reasons to attract themselves from any mother figure. I think it's sort of different to that. Maybe again it refers to a fact of this aspect of someone teaching someone how to live their life, someone bringing up another person, someone welcoming someone into another world. And maybe it just makes it easy for Kojima to introduce these characters if they have been without that sort of aspect in their lives. It makes it much more easier to understand why Raiden acts the way he does, because he was brought up on the battlefield. He was brought up to live this life of a soldier at a very young age, something us as normal citizens would have a great deal of difficulty understanding, because obviously we've been brought up with paternal and maternal influences that would have told us to stay away from that way of life.
I agree with you. I think it's a narrative technique that Kojima's used. I think it's a really easy way, in terms of storyline, to explore that nature versus nurture concept. And in addition to that, it's an easy way to present a person who, in some ways, has probably been exceptionally vulnerable in the past. So the characters that are fatherless, that are motherless, I think we, as human beings, we naturally assume that therefore they've had kind of like a very different childhood. They've had a very, like a lesser childhood. I think that's fair to say. And certainly a childhood that's affected them mentally. And it's an interesting way to explore not only what it is that made those characters turn to the battlefield and what it was that toughened them up, let's say, what took them from a state of, as I say, vulnerability to a state of strength, and linking that in with this idea that maybe it isn't our genes that are dictating what we do. Maybe it's the way that we're brought up. And I feel that relationship between genes, parents, and the nature versus nurture discussion, I think that's really why he's doing it.
I think going on from the comment you made in terms of the vulnerability, I think that's, for me, that was really, really poignant in Metal Gear Solid 2 with Raiden, and the fact of his storyline, and where over the course of the story you find out that he was this child soldier, and you could argue that all the way through that game he's looking for a father figure, whether it's Snake himself, Pliskin, or it becomes Solidus. because he doesn't have this father figure in his life, you can kind of argue that he's looking for these father figures, which he eventually does, at least in a technical term, finds in Solidus, although in that, because Solidus is the closest thing he's had to a father, even though he didn't realise it, and at the end, he, in the same way as in Metal Gear Solid 3, where Snake kills the maternal figure for him, in Metal Gear Solid 2, it's Raiden who has to destroy the only figure that he has. And I think that's another thing, the fact that there is a lot of the lack of parental figures in it, but also it's the fact of sometimes having to destroy for the greater purpose this parental figure, whether it's the mother or the father, destroying it for the greater good. And it becomes the vulnerability and then the loss of losing what you've just found, which is, I think is especially prevalent in definitely 2 and 3, and then elements of it come into it in 4 when again he meets Big Mom, and then when she dies, although that's not as a result of Snake, he hasn't killed her, but it almost gives the impression that these characters were destined to be alone. They're not to have relationships, though at the end, yes, Raiden is left with a family and he will continue. You get the feeling that these characters aren't meant to have lives like a normal person. They're meant to be alone.
We think about it, although, you know, we've asked the question, you know, why do so many of the characters in the game not have fathers and you know, not have parents, let's say. Really, the entire storyline is about the relationship between a father and a son. It is about Jack and it is about David. It's about Snake and Solid and their relationship, the relationship between Big Boss and between Solid Snake, his biological son. There is a paternal feel to a lot of the storyline. It's just that those characters are absent in physical form, but Big Boss is present and very much, I would say, in the mind of Solid Snake throughout all of his adventures.
Snake's got to a point, especially in the second game, where he realizes, especially what he witnessed between Otacon and his sister, and definitely how Campbell deals with his niece Meryl in the first game, that it's those characters who have family that are the most vulnerable on the battlefield. They are the ones that seem to suffer the most, and more than anything, Snake understands why, even though I'm sure, like anyone, he would long to find out, well, he knows who his father is, that Snake doesn't essentially want to really connect with a father figure, because he knows essentially genetically who his father is. But it's more of a case that he realizes how detrimental is it to him as a person and to the job that he has to do, what he's brought up to doing, what introducing a family into his life could do to that mission. It's why he's so cold to Eva, why he doesn't let her into him. It's one of the reasons why Big Boss would have brought him into that tapped into that maternal instincts of Snake to stop him falling in love, to stop him looking at women in that way, to keep his mind focused on the battlefield. He understands, just like his father did, that letting family in, letting those elements in, can just distract you from your main mission and your main focus. I don't think you ever go searching for it.
Which is why the relationship between him and Sonny in MGS4 is such a fraught one. You know,
yeah.
He's constantly
well, it's awkward.
He's constantly awkward around her. Yeah, and he snaps at her and he doesn't really get her. He doesn't understand kids. He's never had to deal with them. He's never been in a traditional family unit. You know, as Olga says, she says near the beginning of MGS2, you know, the unit was my family. And I believe she says conflict and victory were my parents. Yeah. I think Snake is in exactly the same way, and that's why in MGS2 they form, why Olga and him form such a special bond, because they feel roughly the same. They both feel that it was war that brought them up. It wasn't you know, this traditional stereotypical sort of nuclear family.
And you have this interesting obvious metaphor that the people brought up naturally have the names of natural animals. The people brought up within the bounds of war, their snake, their foxes, their mantises, their wolves. animals that naturally are brought up and learnt to survive by their own and learnt to cope with their surroundings. And it's the people like Merrill and Otacon who have their names and share their names with Snake. I believe that Otacon's probably one of the first people that Snake encounters who really starts to open up with him, who's emotionally vulnerably weak, and Snake has a hard time dealing with that in Metal Gear Solid 1, but even probably up to Metal Gear Solid 4 he still has a problem dealing with Otacon's emotional weakness, but sort of deals to get over it. And so you have this obvious division between the people who have names and can break away from that circle, as we quoted Merrill earlier on in the podcast. These people who can break the circle and realise that you don't have to live by these defined chains of fate. Then these others that live this life of nature, of you procreate, you eat, and you die. And those are the rules that they live by, and your way of life is extending and performing those tasks. It's just another one of those obvious draws for people who missed it. This is what Kojima is trying to say.
I think he had a bit of a lonely childhood. I mean, his parents were together and things, but he was very much a child who he was always used to coming home to an empty house. His parents worked, so he was just by himself in a house. So he felt quite lonely, and maybe that desire there for wanting to have somebody there with him, kind of a parent, as a child growing up, probably soaks its way into this game as well. But if we kind of look through the series, you kind of get this sense of loss and incompleteness. MGS1 is all about fighting over the father. I mean, literally, the terrorist demands, these Foxhound, is the fact they want the remains of Big Boss handed over. And then that escalates into the meeting of these two brothers fighting over the remains of the father, incidentally. MGS2, this idea of being the father, solid as Snake, he loses an eye. He looks a lot more like Big Boss as we know him from Metal Gear and Metal Gear 2. So this idea, Olga's relationship with her father, Fortune avenging her father as well. And then in an interview afterwards for Metal Gear Solid, it's on the Subsistence disc, Kojima said that he'd already done a lot of paternal things in games, and he was very much interested in looking at the maternal. And this is where I have to kind of disagree with you on the point that there's no Oedipal aspect here, which I think there is in Metal Gear Solid 3. It's a very, very complex relationship between the major players being Jack, the boss, Volgin, and Ocelot acting as his sort of unofficial brother. There is very much an Oedipal triangle going on there. But of course, the maternal aspect of the mother, I mean, did you know, for example, that originally Hideo Kojima envisaged the boss as being having like one of her breasts hanging out of her costume, as if breastfeeding almost. She was a mother that was always going into battle, and that snake scar that you see on her chest, you only see at the end of the game, that would be shown. And there's this idea that when she was shooting her gun, it would all vibrate and the snake would look like it was laughing, and that was the sort of the legend that was surrounding her, that if you saw that snake laughing, it was the last thing you'd see before you'd die. So then this idea of maternity kind of met in Metal Gear Solid 4 with a paternal, which is why I think Metal Gear Solid 4 is very much about being a parent. So we have Big Mama, we have Big Boss, we have Jack meets his child, and then but then Snake becomes the anomaly again. He doesn't know how to react to Sonny, but we've got Hal. He doesn't really know how to sit with Sonny either. This child that they've just suddenly been landed on their lap, that they've rescued from the clutches of the Patriots. So I mean, it's what I love is the organic process that Kojima's gone through, starting with this paternal, which is tailed end off the Metal Gear series, into the Metal Gear Solid that is, just because he wanted a change of scenery, he chose to flip to the maternal, and they've met together for the final sort of hurrah at the end.
Okay, what we're going to look at now is we're going to try and discuss how the Metal Gear Solid series has influenced our games today. Which games do we see as being directly influenced and of using elements of the gameplay, the stealth perhaps nature, the narrative structure, the storylines? Which games have directly been influenced from them? Pete, is there any particular game in which when you've played it, you've seen Metal Gear Solid kind of shining through in various elements?
I think there are a lot of games that were affected by Metal Gear Solid and Kojima's sort of revamp, I suppose, and reintegration of stealth into video games, and specifically into 3D video games. There's nothing really quite like Metal Gear Solid. I think that not too many people have tried either to really imitate Metal Gear Solid. The only notable exception was a game called Operation Winback, which was on the 64 and the Dreamcast, I think, in the end. That was kind of MGS's nearest competitor, except for it was a lot more clean and a lot more colourful. But on a larger sort of scale, if you look at Siphon Filter, if you look at Splinter Cell, Hitman, some of the later Tenchu games, I would say that they're very much influenced by Metal Gear indirectly, in so much as they incorporate stealth and they incorporate a lot of the ideas that MGS as a series kind of implemented. Each of those games has things like enemy AI that sets itself to set routines and patterns. Metal Gear kind of introduced alert states into gaming, and to the dynamic of being much weaker against larger opponents and more plentiful opponents. Games like Thief kind of took the idea of stealth that MGS arguably birthed for what I would call the modern era of video games, and did something very different with it. Like Metal Gear, tried to include a lot of story and a lot of character development. You've got so many different companies that have been influenced, like Rockstar making a game like Manhunt and Manhunt 2. You've got games like BioShock, even games like BioShock that are sort of released in this current generation of consoles, your 360s, your PS3s. They have stealth aspects, and without Metal Gear Solid, it's difficult to say whether or not stealth would have been put into those games, because it just wasn't something that was popular. I mean, if we think about stealth before Metal Gear Solid specifically, really the only examples of it are Metal Gear and Metal Gear 2, and I don't know, perhaps the odd game here and there, but really nothing of any significance, and certainly no game that particularly got it right. So surely in terms of stealth, Metal Gear Solid kind of changed the landscape and kind of made stealth sections a dirty word in some circles. It created games that could be tense based on inaction. But also, I would say in terms of storylines and narrative, games got a lot more sophisticated post 1997, 1998, when MGS was really taking a hold. There are tons of examples of games that tried to do things narratively that were complicated post MGS, but when you look earlier than that, you have extremely clumsy attempts at trying to tell a story or trying to explore hidden meaning in video games. And I think that a lot of retro games criticism in particular almost wants to try and find those games that are narrative driven prior to MGS, and I think that a lot of games get more praise for their stories than perhaps they would be, because really Metal Gear Solid is the turning point for narrative in video games. I said it in the first show, and I'll say it again: if we didn't have Metal Gear Solid, we wouldn't have a Heavy Rain.
The stealth nature of Metal Gear Solid is kind of really just influenced me as a gamer, how I play games. Sam, as you know, I'm quite a cautious stealth game player.
Yes, you are, yeah.
I do like to take my time, but as a consequence, it's really, really enhanced my sort of playing of other games that aren't stealth games, platforms, for example, first-person shooters. and it's really influenced the entire sort of nature of my sort of stuff. And in retrospect, with stealth, you kind of have this sense of having to show a 360-degree awareness of your environment. I mean, that's obviously prevalent in most games anyway, but as what you said, Pete, having more of these choices means that idea is compacted. You're constantly on edge, you're constantly looking around, and as a consequence you take in and you soak up more of the gaming architecture and the gaming landscape. And for me, that is what the buzz I get from Metal Gear Solid. Yes, there's a lot of waiting, and yes, there's that thrill that you're not being seen, but also, in part of that, you're seeing the landscape around you. You're seeing this place. You're feeling this place, the textures, the sound of footsteps and things. These are what you take in. And as a gamer now, when I'm playing games, I can't shift that idea. My perspective is widened as a consequence. I feel as if I've got 20/20 vision now when playing a game. My field of gaze is widened. It's fantastic.
There's also another area which I think that Metal Gear Solid has really sort of inspired the future and of games, probably even in a broader sense, inspired the whole medium of games as an art form. And I think it's whether for good or whether for bad, there's this stark cohesion with film in every single one of the Metal Gear Solid games. There's this unashamedly brash delivery of a story which is kind of, when you finish the first Metal Gear Solid, you think to yourself, was I really playing it for that long? And you realise that half of the game was just taken up by these glorious filmic sequences, and it's prevalent for the second one. It's even more enhanced with the codec messages every time you save, and it gets a little bit monotonous depending on how often you save, which for me is quite a lot, with Paramedic, and she talks about her love of film. Major Zero shares to you his love of James Bond and how he admires his Englishness and this sort of admiralty, and it's this love of film and this passion of a media, of an art form that Kojima has embraced, which a lot of games have taken on in terms of their production values, in terms of how they approach certain sequences. I think that definitely Naughty Dog are one definitely development company that have approached games in terms of a filmic way on the back of Metal Gear Solid in exactly the right way, and moved it forward to where you get these dramatic sequences that you are a part of, that you can move within the film happening and feel more of a part of it. And without Metal Gear Solid embracing that cohesion with film, embracing that other aspect of an art form to enhance games as an art form themselves, I think we wouldn't have certain moments in Uncharted. I think we wouldn't have certain glorious cinematography and boundless silent movies almost like Flower. And it was Kojima's bravery and astuteness to just say, I love films and I want films to be a great part of my games, that allowed other developers to go, well, we can embrace this art form as well to help inform and improve ours.
Don't you think that that's an amazing thing? The fact is that over the past month or so of podcasts, we've waxed lyrical and we've been really, really overly, glowing of the Metal Gear series, because we love this franchise and we've all got some sort of connection to it, and that's why we chose this series in particular to start, our sort of special podcast series. But it's odd that for all of the improvements that are brought to the table that we've mentioned, games that are more filmic, many more options for ways to play and create games, inclusions of cutscenes and quick time events such as the torture scene in MGS1. For all of these things, there's kind of there's a negative side to all of them as well, in so much as Metal Gear Solid has introduced so many concepts that are now fundamental to video games that it is, ironically, the themes and ideas that are presented within the game itself. The design, that in so much as design has kind of begun to eat itself, almost very much like a curled snake, in so much as Metal Gear Solid kind of took stealth and presented it, and then suddenly we've got all of these games that have stealth elements in them and that don't particularly work very well. And then that feeds back in, and then people are kind of annoyed with stealth games. By the time MGS4 rolls around, you've got a game that's actually, ironically, a lot more action heavy. You know, it's this weird cyclical nature of games design that things influence one another. And it is very strange that all of these great things that the series brought to the table really have influenced games in a very negative way at the same time.
So you're saying then that it's kind of diluted itself through its popularity and in other forms, in other games, as it were.
It was so popular that it spawned so many pretenders that when we go back to the MGS series, we can just think that it's another game within the stealth action genre. But before MGS, there was no such thing as the stealth action genre. And it's such an odd thing. Like I say, I think it does come back to this idea of Ouroboros. I think it is this idea that the things that were created within the series have almost come to kind of bite the series again, and also affect both positively and negatively the games industry and the way that we create games.
Finally, we cannot leave a discussion on the final part of InRetroSolid without asking each of you a very basic, but maybe not easy to answer question. Firstly, I'd like to know which is your favourite game of the series, and secondly, which is your favourite standout moment or sequence from the series. While you're all thinking of your moment or sequence, I'm going to come over first with your favourite game. I'm going to start with you, Kris. What would be your favourite game of the Metal Gear Solid series?
Having played all four of them, playing the fourth one actually just a few months ago, my favourite game of the series is going to have to be Metal Gear Solid 3, Snake Eater. It is undoubtedly my favourite game. It's got everything I love about the first game, but it's got the gameplay of that sort of brought in for Metal Gear Solid 2, and I think I kind of see it as a synthesis of the first two games, really, that have really kind of come to a head and really shone in this third incarnation. And also just because there's a lot of depth to it. For me, it's just the fact that I'm seeing the beginning of something huge. I'm seeing the beginning of a saga. I'm playing his big boss. This is going to be these actions, these things I'm doing here with this person in this game are going to have massive repercussions throughout the whole of the Metal Gear saga, and he is unaware of what I know. It's a sense that I have omniscience. I know things that my character doesn't know, which is quite an interesting thing. Usually you're kind of on the same sort of page with them, and don't get me wrong, there are little bits of surprises on the way and things, and you make links to subsequent events. But for me, it's Metal Gear Solid 3.
And I would have to chime in my agreement with that. I think definitely my favourite is Metal Gear Solid 3. I thought it was always going to be Metal Gear Solid 1 that was my favourite, just because of the initial reaction that I had to it when I played it first. But after finishing Metal Gear Solid 3, it just seemed to connect with me a lot easier than the other Metal Gear Solid games. I think the story is told in a concise and more of a constructive way, which lets the narrative breathe a lot more and seems a lot less convoluted and a lot less strung out than it is in other Metal Gear Solid games. I think the characters are a lot more fleshed out, and indeed a lot more, well, I think they're even presented in more of a concise and well-rounded fashion. Even the bosses are endearing in their own separate qualities. They're scary and they're frightful, and you kind of want to learn more about them. When I battled the Fury, I wanted to find out what it is that they'd done in space, what had happened then. I wanted to find out what had happened to the fear, the pain, what was the connection with the Hornets. I was more intrigued by the bosses there than I was in really any other of the Metal Gear Solid series. Certainly the Beauty and the Beast core, such a good idea, and something that I really wanted to get behind, but having Drebin explain that to you in a codec sequence seemed so detached and so uninvolved that it was just tempting just to look away and not feel a part of that. But I felt Metal Gear Solid 3 just does all that so well, and there's just some brilliant bits like with the Shagohod, and for me the jungle environment is the best environment that he's been in, and I connected with that environment a lot easier than I have many of the others.
Well, as I mentioned on my show, MGS2 it's definitely my favourite in the series, and I get the arguments for MGS3, and in fact I get the arguments for all of them. I think in some ways they're all, kind of the best in the series, but I'm kind of a sucker for like experimentation in games, like something that, even if it doesn't work particularly well, a brave choice in a video game to me is more interesting than a solid mechanic. It's the reason that I like the work of Suda51, for example. A creator who makes games that are a bit rubbish, but they try some new and weird things. For me, MGS2 is the game in which Kojima is the most experimental, and it's the one where he very much lays the foundations of the series as it would become known, as it would go on to be. I think that as I mentioned, like I think that MGS2 influenced number 3, number 4, certainly influenced Portable Ops and Peace Walker. It would go on to influence the first game in the remake, and I think that Kojima was kind of let loose on this new piece of technology with the PS2, and was kind of promised all these amazing things that this hardware could do, and so he let his imagination run absolutely riot. And when it finally came down to it, and actually the PS2 couldn't do some of the things that he wanted it to, just simply wasn't powerful enough. I think that he kind of wanted to keep those elements in, and you certainly get the feeling that this is a craftsman in his field who's been given complete carte blanche to do whatever he wanted. He's half the back of Metal Gear Solid, and to a lesser extent his success with his critical success with Snatcher and Policenauts in Japan, and he's almost at the top of his game after Metal Gear Solid, and he's given the opportunity to work on this brand new piece of hardware for a release that's very early on, and he's given early access to this incredible system, and so you do start to see all these things that you've never seen in games before, like from the very small things like using your SOCOM to shoot a pipe which shoots steam in a soldier's face so that you can take them out easier, to the little sort of incidental animations like Snake sneezing because he's been out in the cold for too long, the fact that the system keeps track of how long you are outside in the rain and the wet, little graphical flares like when you go from an area of darkness to light, just the sort of the visual filter that gives that sense of the pupils contracting, and in other ways the things like the dog tags, for example, on that Raiden has at the end of the game, the fact that he was thinking about players putting their name into the game and how that would affect the story, and how the player could be brought in even further into the game. The fact that he risked massive fan backlash, and indeed did get a lot of fan backlash, for making the main character of the game not Snake. For 2/3 of the game you don't play Snake. For most of it you don't see him. I think this was the point that he was the most experimental, and to me that's the most interesting thing.
I'd probably say for my favourite game, I would agree with you. I like Sam. I thought I might go for the Metal Gear Solid 1, being as it was where it all started, and then maybe once I played it in Metal Gear Solid 4 as well, I thought maybe that might do. But when I look back, I mean, from perhaps for different reasons, I would say the second one is my favourite. I mean, I think I enjoy the narrative of the second one quite a lot. I mean, the narrative, I think, as Kojima said, as one of the reasons he chose Raiden is because he wanted to keep the idea of the protagonist being quite a vulnerable character. And after having the first game, he didn't feel he could have Snake again because that wouldn't be believable as being a vulnerable character. And I think with Raiden, the vulnerability, because he is this rookie agent, his first field mission, and it's kind of a coming of age because at the start of it, he's so unsure and he questions everything. And then by the end of it, I wouldn't say he's not assured, but he's kind of come full circle. He defeats Solidus at the end, and he's become almost a hero, even though he's not happy in his life. He's lost things, everything's been taken away from him, but he's realised who he is. And I think for me, it's a very poignant storyline because I mean we've talked at great length about the narratives throughout the games. So I'm very much looking forward to where they take it with Metal Gear Solid Rising, because I mean I preferred the character of Raiden in the second game as opposed to Metal Gear Solid 4, and so I'm very interested to see where else he can take that character, because I was a bit disappointed at the end of the fourth game when he came out as kind of reformed and good as new. I feel he's a tragic character and he's a very powerful character in the game, in the series of Metal Gear.
See, I think that the reason that Raiden was saved in that way is because Snake has to be left as the one tragic character in it all. He has to be left as the one person who is, after all that he's been through from beginning to end, he's the one that is left on his own. And for that happen to Raiden as well, I think would distill and dilute a little bit of the impact that we'd have at Snake at the end. Snake has to be the one that's left on his own, that's left with the burden of that, and cannot break the cycle. Whereas Raiden is that man who's been through it all, looked like he was going to follow in Snake's footsteps, and he manages to break that cycle, and he manages to go from a father and a motherless upbringing to taking part in the natural sociological way of life. And that's why I think anyway Kojima decided to save him and not make him out to be a tragic character just like Snake, that he broke that cycle.
I agree with you, Sam. I mean, going back to a point Frosty made about Metal Gear Solid 2, the Raiden in Metal Gear Solid 2, there is this sense of, if we're looking for like a father figure, maybe a mentor is probably the best word rather than father figure. You've got Iroquois Pliskin, which kind of does that for Raiden in the same way that he did it for Meryl and things in Metal Gear Solid. But Metal Gear Solid 4, Raiden very much becomes his own man. He's no longer, which is why some people I think were kind of felt cheated in Metal Gear Solid 2 by Raiden. He's no longer depicted. He's not a younger Snake. He's not a Snake that can move quicker and do cartwheels rather than forward rolls. There's many people out there who disagree with the choice of Raiden in Metal Gear Solid 2. I mean, what I liked about him was the fact that I got to see this legend through somebody else's eyes rather than being my own. It felt like I was generally having an out-of-body experience. It was quite an interesting experience, and having that, being able to watch this person do their own thing, not being controlled by me, but literally let alone to do their own thing, was quite an interesting sort of experience. But Raiden really becomes his own man in Metal Gear Solid 4, which is why I prefer him in number 4 than I do to number 2.
Okay, I think what we'll do now is we'll go back and look at our favourite standout moments. I've given you all a bit of time to think of something. I want to come to you again, Kris. So what was your favourite standout moment or sequence from the entire series?
My favourite sequence, I mean, the favourite thing that I got to do in the series, I think, was probably... Now, this is an interesting one for me, because as a rule, I don't like boss battles in games. It's not because of any artistic or intellectual reason, it's just I'm a child, and it just stresses me out taking on a boss battle. It stresses me out. I hate boss battles. For Sam, who watched me go through every single boss battle in Metal Gear Solid 4, he knows how annoying I am when I'm doing boss battles. I'm a child. I'm an absolute child. Which is why I think it's really unusual that my favourite moment in the gaming series is a boss battle. And that has got to be my favourite boss battle of all time, and that is the end in Metal Gear Solid 3. I love this bit. It's my favourite moment. The fact that it just... there's something quite primal about it. It takes a stealth gaming and turns it back to its roots about why as human beings we are stealthy. the fact that you have to track your boss. You track your boss. Literally, you take in everything, all the atmospherics, where the sun is shining, so you can see the light reflecting off his sniper lens. Literally seeing where his footsteps are, being quiet, making sure you don't go around in front of him, making sure that you can literally pinpoint exactly where he is roughly, and making sure that he doesn't know where you are, because you are, after all, taking on the world's greatest sniper, who's got a lot of patience. And for me, for this sort of game, as I mentioned before, I've got tons of patience, and I absolutely love taking on the end. So much so that you'll see the sun go, the rain will appear, then sun again. So that helps with the passing of time. I've never had that sense of feeling in a boss battle where I can take my time. That's what stresses me out in a boss battle, where I feel as if I don't have enough time. And in this, you've got bags of it, because that is the point of this game.
I narrowed it down to 4. If I say things like the corridor in MGS1, Campbell going mad, the end, and microwaves, those are probably my 4 stand-up moments of stretching over the 4 games, probably my stand-up moments of each of the game. And I don't want to tread on my own toes and talk again about the microwave section as I did previously in my podcast, and also not trying to tread on your own toes, Kris, again, but I'm going to have to reciprocate what you say about the end, because that battle and that moment in the MGS series was just one that, well, A, I wasn't prepared for, B, I felt totally overwhelmed within it, and C, I just didn't know kind of what to do. It's a battle that, for once in the whole series, you're faced with this expanse where literally you're covering an area of ground that is hectares, acres and acres and acres huge, which usually during a boss battle you're not used to. There's the little circle Revolver Ocelot runs round in the first game, there's the spire you climb with Raging Raven in the 4th. There's these little pockets of the scenery where you usually take on a boss, but with the end it was, you'd get to a point and the screen would fade out and you'd open up into another area, which you'd only do in the game when you're advancing on in the story. And the first time I did that, I thought, well, have I beaten him? I've moved from another area. Does that mean that I've won? And it totally threw me. And it was just this. I adopted the tactic of using the directional microphone to find him when he was snoring, and it was just so utterly compelling to walk into an area, stop, pull out the microphone. Can I hear anything? Can I hear anything? No. But there was a rustling of the leaves just over there. I'll go over there, but making sure he can't see me. So moving forward a little bit, directional microphone, sweeping areas literally by grid by grid by grid to make sure he wasn't there, and so I could effectively take him on. And then it's that moment when you find him, when you get the snoring down and you see that glint of the telescope, and somehow I managed to get myself a sniper rifle, and just finding him in that scope and realizing that seconds were precious. And it was typical of my luck. I was getting down to literally the last bit of his life, and I was having really big trouble trying to find him out and to search him out and find him. And I turned around, and there he was. He was just literally standing up to move away from where he'd certainly rested. And it was literally instinct just kicked in. Everything I'd learnt from that point in the game just kicked in. I felt like I was there and I was involved. The sniper rifle was still in my hands. It went up, I got him in my sights, right in the head, and that was it, and it ended. And he has such a noble death, and you feel such a sense of nobility for having beaten him, because it's taken you such a lot of effort and such a lot of time. If I compare that to how I beat the Fury, I cornered him in a corner and just thought, well, I'll take the battering. I don't care about my health. I just pumped him full of bullets, and after a while I killed him. And it was the most unnoble way of killing a boss I could have thought of. And that encounter with the end, and the fact that if you lose to him, the penalty for doing so is so huge. It's literally great. You literally, if you lose, if you succumb to the end and he never kills you, he just puts you into a sedate state and takes you back to an area which is literally 20 minutes away. And you again, if you get into that situation, you again have to sneak out of this warehouse. You again have to traverse all this way, and the length of time it takes is initially frustrating, but then you begin to enjoy it and begin to embrace this game, and and learn a lot about it, and it speaks volumes of the Metal Gear Solid series, and it speaks volumes of what it means for a character to take on nature and to be nurtured almost by this one battle.
I've got something written here, and I'm going to have to change my mind, I think. What I've got written down here is the final battle between Snake and Liquid Ocelot on top of... It's Outer Haven, yeah, sorry, on top of Outer Haven. Simply because it was one of the... It was one of those moments... Like, I get very invested in games, and I'm not a particularly emotional person, generally. But that final sequence was exceptionally emotional, because I felt I'd been with the series for so long. I'd really invested, not just in terms of hours, but I'd really, really invested with the character. And that final battle, the changes of life bars from different designs to, modern designs, that sort of thing, between rounds, I suppose. And the swell of the MGS score really did move me. But actually... the bit that... my favourite bit is actually in the first Metal Gear Solid. And it's a favourite bit for me. It's a moment that is only really good in retrospect. And... and it's in the first Metal Gear Solid. And it is when you see...
Pete, if you say when you crawl through the grate over the
when you see Marilyn Arundi's, it just gets me.
That's the time to eat his pants.
Stop it!
There's a moment in the first Metal Gear Solid where Revolver Ocelot says to you, "You look just like the boss," and. If you take all of the other games out, if you were playing it at the time, you could look back at that moment and say, right, well, he's referring to the fact that he looks like his brother. However, Revolver's real boss, as we find out in MGS2, is in fact Solidus. So there's that kind of added layer of, it's possible to conceive that he had MGS2 kind of some of the ideas of MGS2 written when MGS1 was released. That's possible. So that's kind of cool. But then when you take that moment and compare it to MGS3, the boss is obviously it's the boss. It's your mentor. It's your female mentor, and the very fact that he sees a lot of his old sort of comrade, I suppose, within Snake is again a particularly interesting... Is that the way that Kojima meant for the line to come across? Because when we go back and revisit MGS1, the lines that are said take on whole new meaning when we compare them to the rest of the series. And again, to add another layer to it, he could, of course, be referring to Boss as in Snake's biological father, because when we look at something like Peace Walker, all of the NPCs refer to Jack as Boss. They say things like "Okay, boss," and "Right away, boss," and that kind of thing. And he's always known as the boss. It's my standout moment because whether or not any of it was intentional, whether or not he had any idea about MGS2, even MGS2. When we go back with all of this information and we go back to Shadow Moses, we go back to this moment that starts off Metal Gear Solid, and we go back to this part that really does haunt Snake, we can infer so much more meaning simply from drawing from other elements of the series. And for me, that's the standout moment. It's a throwaway line of dialogue, really, in the grand scheme of things. But that, for me, signifies just how amazing and complex and challenging the entire series really is.
I appreciate all of the points you've raised, and there was quite a number of them that I liked. As people were saying, he was very engrossed in the games and he's playing them. I'm quite passive when I play them, and very rarely will I play a game and something very special happens and I will be really taken in by a game. although some of the most beautiful moments I've ever seen and experienced in gaming is in Metal Gear Solid 4, which is where my standout moment was. There is a moment when you return to Shadow Moses, a sequence once you're there, and as you re-experience a number of all the locations, and you have that very strange feeling of remembering a location but also experiencing it for the first time, and it's very unique. And there's a moment where, as you're approaching the corridor where you first meet the ninja in the first game, the original music from the original game, the voiceovers from the original game and this scene start to build into it as well, and all these memories are invoked. And I think we were talking about it at the time when I was playing it, and I was watching it and I could only refer to it as poetry because it flows so well, and I was thinking about it, how I can compare it, and I thought of a very, very strange comparison. And there's a moment in the Peter Weir film, The Truman Show, whereby there's a major scene where the Ed Harris character, who's the director of the show, you see him direct this very emotional scene, and he becomes a conductor, and he builds in all this music and everything. And I watched that scene and I imagine Hideo Kojima somewhere in a room directing that and building in all these different elements and creating something which, for people who know the game and then they've experienced it years ago, is so beautiful that it was a rare moment where I've actually just thought that's a very special. I haven't experienced many moments of that in games or films or television or anything like that. And that whole sequence where they go back to the room, because as we said in the last podcast for Metal Gear Solid 1, that whole sequence with the ninja is probably my favourite from that game. And the return to that area is probably my favourite in the fourth game. There's a line with that as well, which always made me smile, just in that whole sequence there, where he's talking with Otacon, and I think they're talking about how they're going to get around and everything, and he's hacked into the system or done bits and pieces, and he makes just a little side comment saying makes you long for the days when you had key cards, and it takes you back to that first game where you needed a key card for every single level, and you couldn't get through doors because you only had level 1 and you needed level 4 to get through. And I can remember making a mention to you about that, and I was like, yes, it does make you long for those days. And that whole sequence it is a throwback, but it's done in such a beautiful way, and it's not a throwback for the sake of it. It makes perfect sense in it. There's so many moments in that whole sequence of Shadow Moses. For example, when he first gets here and he looks up at the security camera, which in the first game looks around and he gets scared. In the second one, it falls apart. And I tried to explain to my girlfriend when I played it, the feeling of going back to this place. It's like when Dorothy returns to Oz and everything's broken and everything's gone downhill and everything's upside down compared to how she remembers it. And that's the only way I could describe that feeling of going back to this place, which is, as we said earlier, just a shadow of its former self. And so, after a month, 5 podcasts, and much Metal Gear love, we draw a line in the sand under the InRetro Solid series. We hope you've enjoyed our journey through the house which Kojima built, and I'd like to take this opportunity to thank Pete, Sam and Kris for their terrific podcast over the past month. If you've enjoyed what you've heard, please do let us know. You can speak to us on Twitter through InRetroSpect, and leave us reviews on iTunes, the Zune Marketplace, and leave us messages at www.inretrospectpodcast.com. So until next time, this is the InRetroSpect team signing off the codec one final time. Goodbye. Right then, all done.
We should probably play something else next for like another special.
What do you reckon?
I've got an idea.
Don't you think you've seen enough?